The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
He held so many things in the vault. He said there were things he'd done in the past that tore him up, things he was afraid to tell her about, unless she could promise him complete confidence. There are many things I'm ashamed of. There are things I did which scare me to death when I think about the afterlife. There are so many things from my past that have made me who I am, and there's no excuse for it. But I know I have to take ownership of it. Karl Carlson, from Levi's Eyes by Aphrodite Jones. Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. This is episode 89, 2ndCast, Prior Bad Acts, part 3 on Levi's Eyes, A Son's Deadly Secret and a Father's Cruel Betrayal by Aphrodite Jones. I am delighted to bring you this story, which is breathtaking in its scope and access to the mind of a killer, a first. Let me give a shout out to my new Patreon murder bookies, Charles, Susan, and Maria. I see you as you hear me. And Murder Bookies Crimecon 2024 is next week. I am looking forward to meeting many of you in Nashville, May 31st to June 2nd. And please find me on Podcast Row. My Crimecon meetup will be in the Falls Bar Lounge on Friday night, May 31st at 11 p.m. I know it's late, but this is after the John Douglas event, and I think plenty of us will be coming there to hang out anyway. So let's just make this easy. After John Douglas, Falls Bar Lounge at 11:15 p.m. I promise you at least an hour, and then I'm going to go pass out. All right. And listen, our Patreon Zoom is coming up in 2 weeks, June 6th, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So send me your book or your case suggestions and join me on Patreon, $4 a month. Oh, how do you recap this whole thing? Well, in episode 88, Levi Carlson is dead, crushed when the jack failed while he was working on his dad's farm truck, as Karl's terrible luck continues to haunt him. Only Cindy Carlson is now convinced that this wasn't bad luck, but intentional. She's also suspicious that Karl set the house fire that killed Christina, all so he could collect insurance money on them. She hires a PI to investigate as Karl blows through his granddaughters, Electra and Ivy's, annuity money. And Cindy realizes he never intended to save this for them. Then she learns there's $300,000 in life insurance on the granddaughters, taken out by Karl. Fear, anxiety, uncertainty set off her alcoholism, and she and Karl separate, with son Alex being manipulated by his father. Cindy drunk dials her sister Bev and her cousin Jackie, and her fears pour out of her. Listen, there's so much more, so you really need to listen to part 1 and part 2, or just read the book because this one is a humdinger. Cousin Jackie is now deeply concerned about Cindy's welfare. This prompted her to make a call to New York Life, the insurance company, in Manhattan, saying that she's a close relative of Cindy Carlson's, and she has additional information regarding Levi Carlson's fatal accident. Speaking to New York Life investigator Richard Matarante, Jackie shares her belief that Levi was murdered. This freak accident only occurred weeks after the insurance was taken out on him by Karl. Had Karl been there when Levi signed the policies? because Karl was suspected of insurance fraud over his first wife's death back in California. And Jackie learns that Karl paid the initial insurance payment, not Levi, and Matarante was opening an investigation into this case because there had been questions back in 2008 with the initial fraud investigator who did think a criminal investigation should be opened immediately. A week later, Jackie called the Seneca County Sheriff Office, leaving a message for Lieutenant John Clear. By the time they did speak, Jackie was now fearful for her own safety, but at the same time was unable to ignore her conscience. She told the lieutenant that Cindy Carlson, quote, was 99% sure that her husband Karl had gotten away with murder, end quote, citing Levi's death, the barn fire, Christina's death back in 1991. She also thought that Cindy might have dirty hands too, because she'd taken $100,000 from Levi's insurance money as well. Meanwhile, Cindy receives an email from stepdaughter Katie, blaming her drunken behavior for the breakup of the family. Replying, Cindy apologized for drinking, adding that she was in counseling. She shared her concerns about Karl misusing his medication, weaving while driving, especially with Electra and Ivy in the car. Katie replied immediately. Cindy was minimizing her own problem. By now, both Alex and Katie believed that Cindy was the dangerous driver, not Karl, who was only following doctor's orders with his prescriptions, as Karl manipulated them, using Cindy's alcoholism as a weapon. When Karl announced he needed new surgery on his shoulder, he garnered more sympathy from his kids, the perfect ploy which allowed him to continue his OxyContin abuse. Cindy accepted being the bad guy, continuing to drink to drown the heartache. She looked bloated, her skin was blotchy, with empty eyes looking back at her. Finally ready, her sister Bev drove a blitzed, unruly Cindy to detox at Krause Memorial Hospital in Syracuse, where she was admitted. Suffering through withdrawal, Cindy attended group sessions, very much like AA, admitting she'd lost her son and daughter's respect. Dave, another client, shared his story of how alcohol had ruined his life, destroying his marriage and his business. Dave had a big personality, making the room laugh while using, quote, mannerisms to exaggerate his self-deprecating humor, end quote. When asked, Cindy refused his request for her phone number, with Dave suggesting they should be phone buddies, right? Well, they did attend AA meetings together and then went for pizza, where Cindy began filling Dave in all that was going on with Karl. She insisted that Dave stay away as Karl was keeping tabs on her. Yet they continued talking, listening, and sharing. And eventually, Cindy became interested in Dave, going on a picnic at Candandaigua Lake. He was caring and sincere, and wasn't afraid of a buffoon like Karl. But she knew that Karl would blow a gasket if he found out about Dave. Lieutenant John Clear called private investigator Steve Brown on April 6, 2012. Brown shared his conclusions that Karl was desperate and, quote, contemplating future acts of violence, end quote. He included his tale on the disturbing trip to the poultry farm, with Karl enjoying the blood and death that surrounded them, and added that Karl was addicted to pain meds. Karl also had guns, which Brown believed, if cornered, Karl would use. Karl was stressing about money and cashing out his annuities. Most of Karl's siblings loathed the man, and some of the Amish might also have insights into the guy. When Lieutenant Clear finally called Cindy, she responded with, quote, "Thank God you called," end quote. On April 9th, 2012, Cindy gave an 8-hour sworn statement detailing witnessing Levi's accusing Karl of killing his mother that erupted in a violent encounter on Thanksgiving. She regrettably recounted how Levi's insurance money was depleted in about 2 years, mostly on the duck fiasco. And she also gave Claire copies of all the New York Life documents, including the information on the life insurance on Electra and Ivy Carlson. Learning Cindy had divorce papers pending, Lieutenant Claire told her to hold off, keep up the pretense that she wanted to save the marriage. And with the police involved and supportive, Cindy thought she could pull it off. While worrying about keeping Dave's presence a secret, she emailed Karl, saying how she regretted how things had gone wrong. And Karl responded that he wanted things to be different too. They both had their demons, and he loved her. But Karl continued to sabotage Cindy with Alex, even with her sober. He gave Alex whatever he wanted, from a dirt bike to a Bonzi RC speedboat. Then Alex told Karl Cindy had a boyfriend named Dave. Quote, "You're a lying bitch, and you should be proud of yourself for only waiting weeks after you left me to jump in the sack with a drunk like yourself. You stole money that doesn't belong to you, and believe me, I will do whatever it takes to get it back. Don't ever come near me or my family. You're asking for trouble." End quote. He was more agitated and threatening when Aaron spilled the beans that Cindy was snooping in California. Certain Karl would retaliate, Cindy and Dave went to get Alex, choosing to go on the run, fearing Karl would hunt them down. Cindy explained to Alex that his dad was being investigated for Levi's death, with an aghast Alex spilling, and now I'm paraphrasing from the book. "Mom, when I went to see Erin, she told me our father had something to do with Levi's death. We had a big fight about it." Cindy said, "Erin told you that?" Alex replied, "Yeah, I told her she was crazy." Cindy explained that, "Alex, this is real. I'm going to call the sheriff's office and let you talk to one of the detectives." Speaking to Alex, Lieutenant Clare confirmed there was a criminal investigation, but he couldn't say anything more. He instructed Alex not to reveal this conversation with his father. Emotionally shaken, Alex began to sob, struggling. He said to his mom, quote, "I should have said something about this before, because a lot of the time when I was helping Dad at the farm, he would get mad if I wasn't working fast enough, and he used to hit me with a stick or with a shovel." End quote. "What?" cried Cindy. Alex continued, quote, "He said if I went running to Mommy, I'd get hit worse." And Alex was worried. If he would kill one son, he could kill another, and I didn't know what he would do. I really didn't. End quote. Now, realizing that Alex was gone, Karl emailed Cindy, threatening that he'd report Alex as kidnapped. She texted him back. She said she needed time, and Alex was so upset about the divorce, he might be having a nervous breakdown. Alex needed a break, and he loves his father. Well, Karl insisted he better hear from Alex soon. But that didn't happen, so Karl began stalking Alex at his school. When his son didn't show up, Karl called Child Protective Services to report Alex missing. CPS called the Seneca County Sheriff Department, with Claire telling Cindy to bring Alex in to speak with a social worker. While Alex was physically unharmed, Cindy was guilty of neglect. Alex had to report to school, or Cindy would face serious consequences. However, the school worked with Cindy to keep Alex safe and away from Karl. But the tension was real. They managed to evade Karl through the rest of the school year. In July, Dave, Cindy, and Alex decided to take a long road trip to North Carolina and Kentucky to visit family. After 2 months on the run, Claire recommended that they just come home. He had no idea when Karl was going to be arrested, the wheels of justice moving slowly. Demoralized, Cindy asked her sister Bev if she would take Alex for the rest of the summer, with her agreeing. Back home, she and Dave hid in a dark bedroom at night after noticing Karl driving by slowly, time and time again. In September, Karl turned up at Alex's school, dressed in pressed khaki pants and a button-down shirt. Charming his way into administration, No surprise here that he could pull that off. He convinced the staff his wife was making false charges against him. When Alex was notified that his father was here, he flat out refused to see him. Karl now ranted that Cindy had brainwashed Alex, but the school was adamant. It was Alex who refused to come down. Karl was furious, humiliated, and this was all Cindy's fault. Now, Dave was concerned about Cindy working with the police. This was risky, he told her. Understanding, Cindy told Karl that she and Dave had broken up and that she wanted to get back together for the sake of their son. They needed to talk and sort out some things so she could be Mrs. Carlson again. They decided to meet for coffee. Cindy, after watching a Dateline show, brought a small tape recorder. If Karl made threats or incriminated himself, she would be able to prove it. October 4th at McDonald's, Cindy sat down with Karl discussing getting back together. But first, Cindy needed Karl to admit he'd been lying to her about the insurance money. Hoping to make Cindy feel bad for him, he admitted the money was all gone and the duck farm was finished. He'd killed more than 8,000 ducklings because he couldn't feed them. Now this made Cindy feel sick. When she cut this short, Karl flew into a rage, ranting that she turned his son against him, and he was through with her, storming off. Cindy and Dave now drove past the farm to confirm that Karl had killed all those ducks, and quote, "I saw dead ducks all over. It was a sea of dead ducks, piled a foot high, and the smell was so bad I thought I would throw up," end quote. At the house, Cindy saw a sea of trash with food scraps all over the walls. Shocked, she saw that Karl had added a koi pond loaded with fish and a new patio complete with an outdoor bar, all while those poor birds were starving to death. Something this makes me think about. Karl killed these ducks, and he likely burned their horses to death in the barn. And their pet dogs and peacocks, also on the farm, turned up dead. So I have to wonder if he did such things to little animals as a kid. I am betting that he did. While walking out on Cindy, Karl instantly regretted it. While he hated her for leaving, he had made mistakes and his temper had gotten bad. He could do better, he'd change, he even prayed. He emailed Cindy, asking her to give him a little space to change. He'd gone to church and was ready to confess his wrongdoings. Cindy agreed that it would benefit everyone if they could work it out, but they needed to take it slow. The pettiness had to stop, and they had to act like adults. Cindy told him, quote, "If you truly have changed, and if there's more you want to tell me, now would be the time to do it," end quote. They met again, with Cindy saying she missed him, and they sat looking into each other's eyes. It was almost like the old days. Karl took it all in, loving the compliments as Cindy looked for an opening. She mentioned that Cassie was making it tough to see their granddaughters, with him agreeing that this was both their faults. Karl said, quote, "It's always been about Levi. His life was a train wreck, and I blame myself for the way I handled things," end quote, with Cindy sympathizing. Then he blurted out, quote, "And you know, when I went back there that day, because I forgot to give him $50, and I remember he was trying to get underneath and he asked me to jack it up. It was one of those old railroad jacks that Dad used to have. It was really tall, and I jacked it up as high as it could go, but I never put the fucking blocks underneath," end quote. Shocked, Cindy asked him why he hadn't told her this before. Quote, "Because I was scared, and it sort of like slipped." Cindy said, "But if it was an accident, why wouldn't you say something?" Karl now replied, "Put yourself in my shoes. If I would have put the fucking blocks underneath, maybe it would have stopped it. It was an accident," end quote. Cindy grew very serious. Quote, "You know, Karl, if I accept what you just said about Levi, we could go on. But my instinct tells me that you're not telling me everything," end quote. Karl asked why he would kill Levi and said, quote, "And if I said I did it, which I didn't, why would you want to be with me? End quote. Cindy insisted that putting everything out in the open was the only way to move forward, and she certainly wasn't going to say anything to anybody. But she now had to go and meet Bev, and he should think about things. Leaving, Cindy went right over to see Lieutenant Clear, and he told her that Karl admitting he jacked it up wasn't enough. They needed more. Karl set up their next meeting. Cindy reiterated that quote, "If you want me to trust you, then you have to show me you're serious about this. Without you completely coming clean, there is no us. Are you willing to admit to me that you did it?" End quote. She reassured him she would always be his wife, that she'd vowed to love him in good times and in bad. Quote, and she must have hit a nerve because all of a sudden, Karl spit it out. He said he jacked the vehicle up high, which made the truck wobble, and then he just tipped the truck over. How would you be able to do that? Well, it's like when you tip over a wheelbarrow. And I mean, I did it without thinking, end quote. And there it was. She got him to confess. Flying over to the Seneca County Sheriff Office with recorder in hand, she pressed play for John Clear, and the sound came out garbled and unintelligible. Whatever Karl had said was lost. The background noise was really loud too, and she realized this was deliberate. Karl suspected her. Clear asked, would Cindy be willing to wear a wire? It was risky, but undercover cops would also be present, and they'd be able to overhear anything Karl said, a legal necessity to get around marital privilege. The idea was that if a confession is made in public, where it could be overheard, even if you're talking to a spouse, it's permissible in court. Well, a few days later, Cindy met with Karl again, this time at a place of Clear's choosing. She told Karl she didn't want to throw away 18 years of marriage, as he rambled on about his recent shoulder surgery. Sympathizing, she finally said that her time was limited and, quote, could we finish our story from the other day? Because it's still not making sense to me, end quote. Karl insisted he had already told her everything, but Cindy was struggling to accept it. She needed to know he was sorry about it, with him saying, quote, every minute of every day. But did I purposely do it? Not at all, end quote. He had jacked it up and the truck slipped. Cindy interrupted. No, he'd said he pushed the truck. Denying this, Karl now said, quote, he had taken advantage of the situation once it happened, end quote. Oh, so she pressed him, trying to get him to repeat the lost conversation, with him stopping her, quote, did she have a recorder in her purse? Cool as a cucumber, Cindy handed her purse over and asked him if he wanted to go through it, but he stopped short, end quote. The question and answer continued. Karl said, quote, the truck fell over on him. Cindy asked, did it fall hard? Karl said, no. Cindy asked, you had to bump it? Karl said, no, because it's so wobbly because the front is off the ground 2 feet, end quote. Karl made an analogy. It's like picking up a wheelbarrow, except pick it up from the front, and rolling it forward and backwards is going to be hard, but moving it from right to left is simple. It just rolls, end quote. And then he promised her that Levi had not suffered, and that all of this was due to his methadone addiction. Well, now Clear had enough. He asked Cindy to set up one more rendezvous in a public restaurant so they could arrest Karl, which finally happened on November 23rd, 2012. John Clear and New York State investigator Tom Crowley sat down with Karl in the interrogation room. Mirandized, Karl agreed to speak with them without an attorney. When he learned they had his confession, he asked them if he needed an attorney, and Clear gave him the chance to make the call, but Karl changed his mind. He had nothing to hide. You see, he thinks he's the smartest guy in the room. Remember that. 9 hours. Karl tangled himself in his own lies for 9 hours. Version 1. Karl insisted he hadn't killed Levi, as Crowley pushed him, questioned him, and pressed him. And Karl insisted that you don't kill anybody for money. Crowley raised a brow, quote, "Who said anything about money?" End quote. Karl now admitted it was he who made the first payment on Levi's insurance to help him out. Cindy was a liar, and his drug addiction was to blame. Methadone, antidepressants, fentanyl patches, Vicodin. He was doped up when he confessed to her. He was helping Levi out, having him work on the truck, because Levi was unemployed and he didn't trust his ex-wife. Well, question, when was the last time he saw Levi alive? Well, Karl skipped that, saying that he found Levi after he got home at 4 p.m. He then went on about Cassie and Levi's custody battle and his time in the service. Crowley pulled it back. Enough of Karl's rambling Fantasyland stories. Crowley informed him that they were aware that Levi's insurance policy was taken out less than a month before he died, just like Christina's. Karl launched into calling Cindy an alcoholic and how she had destroyed his duck business. While adopting a grandfatherly tone, Claire sympathized with the pain and all that Karl had suffered. Was Karl too drugged up to realize he'd pushed the truck on Levi? Karl replied that he was drugged up, but not that drugged up. Hours more went by. Crowley finally said, "Look, we know what happened." Karl was swaying, rocking, and version number 2 came forth. Tears falling, Karl said he knew Levi was dead before he left for the funeral. He had gone in to give him $50 and found him crushed under the truck. Quote, "I made the decision to walk out on my son and to not get him out from under the truck." End quote. And that is second-degree murder. But Claire was still hoping for more. Claire said, eyeballing Karl, quote, "You went away for 4 hours and came back and put on a big show. Why pretend it was an accident?" End quote. Back and forth, it was a game of ping pong. Claire offered, quote, "Come on, this wasn't premeditation. Shit happens sometimes, Karl." End quote. And then version 3 came forth. Karl said, quote, "I opened the truck door because I had to move the linkage for the truck, and when I did, it tipped. It just fell over. And I made the decision to walk out on my son and not get him out from underneath the truck." End quote. Levi was dead before he and Cindy headed to the funeral, and Karl had caused the truck to fall. Claire told Karl, quote, "The brutal truth is, you did kill him. Whatever your intent was, the action you took caused the truck to fall on him, and the inaction of leaving him there contributed." End quote, with Karl murmuring in agreement. And he was placed under arrest. It was after 9 p.m., and Claire asked him to write down a summary of what he had just told them, and then Karl was booked with a $500,000 bail. Unable to make bail, Karl would remain in jail. Erin came to visit her father between Christmas and New Year's, confident she could get his confession about the Murphy's house fire and killing her mother. Grinning ear to ear, he said to Erin, quote, "It's been over 20 years since her death. What makes you think they're going to get me now?" End quote. He was indicted on November 29, 2012, by the Seneca County Grand Jury on one count of second-degree murder and insurance fraud. At the preliminary hearing, Karl, who's 52 now, wearing an inmate orange jumpsuit, entered the court using a walker. All right, this reminds me of Joe D'Angelo, that fake phony coward feigning being a frail old man. How pathetic. Defense attorney Lawrence Kasprick tried to get the confession tossed, claiming it was coerced. That failed. The judge also ruled that Cindy's undercovering recording in the public restaurant did not violate marital privilege, so this evidence would be in too. By now, the case had attracted national attention, with media swarming like locusts, and the star witness was Cindy Carlson, who testified about the huge insurance payout from Levi and Christina's death. Her suspicions came into sharp focus in 2012 when she agreed to wear a wire and her husband admitted he had, quote, took the opportunity to let Levi die, end quote. After her testimony, the media was not kind to Cindy, reporting that she'd only cooperated with the police after discovering a $1.2 million insurance policy on her. Her cousin Jackie came out as the hero of the story, and this stung Cindy badly, given the emotional turmoil she'd endured. After the preliminary hearing, the district attorney, Barry Porsche, offered Karl a plea deal, which he soundly rejected. He was innocent, he was framed, and he'd prove it. The night before the criminal trial was to begin, on November 6, 2013, Karl took the plea deal after all. Paraphrasing now. At sentencing, the judge asked, "Was your son on his back underneath the front of the truck doing repair work?" "Yes," Karl responded. "The truck was held up by a single jack?" Karl said, "Yes, it was on the front bumper." "Is it true you knew the jack was not stable?" "Yes," Karl responded. "Is it true that you jumped in the truck knowing Levi was underneath it?" "Yes," Karl said. "The truck did fall on Levi as a result of your actions, correct?" Karl said, "Yes." "You realize Levi was still alive, and you made no attempt to lift the truck off him or summon any help?" "Correct," Karl said. "You acknowledge that Levi was unable to help himself when you left, and without your help, he was highly likely to die?" "Correct," Karl said. Utterly chilling. I couldn't do that to a squirrel, let alone my own child. That is psychopathy. Karl was sentenced to the minimum, 15 years to life. With Uncle Mike beside her, Erin spoke to the media. Quote, "I can't speak for every member of my family, but I think a lot of us had our suspicions after Levi died. When Karl was arrested for it, I don't think any of us were terribly shocked." End quote. However, she went on, blaming Cindy for stealing from Levi's daughters. The next day, Cindy granted her first interview with Syracuse.com. She was crushed at being maligned by her stepdaughters, who ignored her pivotal role in solving this case. If she hadn't acted, Karl would still be free, and there would be no justice for Levi. She believed that once the truth came out and the trial was over, the Carlsons would be grateful. They were not. All they wanted was an accounting of the missing insurance money, most squandered by Karl on his ducks, and they treated Cindy like a criminal. Levi's ex-wife Cassie spoke to reporters too. And while Cassie admitted that it was likely Electra and Ivy, now 10 and 8 years old, were Karl's next targets, she didn't credit Cindy for protecting her daughters either. Quote, "It doesn't give them anything back that was stolen from them." End quote. Cassie read a heartfelt victim's impact statement to the court, this time indicating she was grateful to Cindy for helping to put Karl behind bars. She read short statements written by the girls, reducing the gallery to tears. Colette, Christina's sister, spoke next, her crystal blue eyes flashing. She wanted Karl to pay for her nephew's death, but also her sister's, Christina Carlson's. She said he'd left her sister in a burning house and to rot in jail forever. As for Karl, well, the statements didn't faze him. They were all lying. And Judge Dennis Bender sentenced him to 15 years to life, saying that Carlson was, quote, "not fully human. You belong in prison, and I suggest you belong there until you die," end quote. Speaking to reporters afterwards, District Attorney Posh said Karl was a sociopath. But Karl knew his attorney was planning to appeal, but then accused his attorney of being unethical and tricking him into making a false confession. He'd sue the bum after the appeal was filed. Karl claimed that he was wrongfully convicted, that he'd only taken the plea deal to spare his family the ugly trial, and his daughter Katie believed him. A cop, Katie had seen the medical examiner's report on Levi, stating his death occurred at 3 p.m. Well, then, Karl was at the Walmart when Levi died. Katie believed that Cindy's new memories from Levi's death were manufactured during a contentious divorce. She was an alcoholic and a turncoat with an agenda who'd spent all that insurance money. Well, murder bookies, we know that time of death is very subjective, as should Katie, being in law enforcement. But this is so close to her, I don't think she can see things clearly. And I really hope they've all gotten therapy to begin properly processing all of this. Now, Cindy was just horrified that after all this, Aaron and Katie turned on her. She tried to tell Aaron the whole story, but Aaron was fixated on the money. And hey, to be fair, that's a significant amount of money involved in all of this. Now, Karl wasn't down and out. He granted Katie power of attorney, manipulating her that Cindy would come and try to clean him out. Well, with all this bad blood, Cindy swung by her house and thought she'd been robbed. Quote, the dining room furniture was missing. The bedroom furniture was gone. The flat screen TV was ripped off the wall. But what really devastated me? Levi's ashes were missing. End quote. Shocked, she notified John Clear, who realized it was probably Katie. Clear said that with the power of attorney, Katie had a legal right to be there. Cindy sent a scathing email to Katie. The divorce judge had ordered that no assets be removed from the house, and Cindy threatened legal action if the property was not returned. Well, Katie never responded, selling off Karl's tractors, expensive tools, farm equipment to fund his appeal. Cindy felt that this house was hers, that the girls hadn't lived there in years, and yet they thought nothing there belonged to her. Well, Alex, he was caught in the middle, and he felt Levi's ashes should have been divided up among them. He is correct, of course, from the mouth of babes. Alex now revealed to Cindy that at a lunch with his sisters, they had ganged up on him. Aaron and Katie knew that he was stealing stuff from the house, and Aaron was going to have him arrested. Cindy's jaw dropped. Alex was an innocent in all of this, and they had gone way too far. After another scathing messenger post, Cindy was done with both Aaron and Katie. They cared not one whit for their little brother, and none ever spoke again. Katie could just not accept that her father was a killer, blocking it out. So she was the easiest for Karl to manipulate. She is not alone in utilizing what Sigmund and Anna Freud called defense mechanisms. Psychological defense mechanisms are mental coping skills used to protect one's psyche from the trauma of reality. We use them to cope with distress, trauma, anxiety. We've all heard the expression, you're in denial, when you just refuse to acknowledge reality or its consequences. Well, signs that one is in denial: refusing to talk about a problem, blaming other people or outside forces for causing the problem, and persisting in the behavior despite negative consequences. Possibly significantly relevant to the family dynamic taking place here. So I am paraphrasing now. Distortion, consciously or unconsciously misrepresenting facts to make them more acceptable to one's mind. Projection, attributing one's own characteristics on another to avoid responsibility or deflect criticism. Oh, this is a big one. People use this one all the time. Dissociation, disconnecting from trauma or threats to protect the mind from emotional damage. Repression, unconsciously blocking out painful memories. Intellectualization, using reasoning and logic to rationalize something negative away. Displacement, redirecting negative emotions towards someone else. So you're finding a more acceptable person to blame. I think that one's being used a little bit here. Kind of handy. Now, given the horrors that this family is dealing with, all are acting to defend themselves, which is causing more dysfunction and angst, which is completely understandable given this unbelievable reality that Karl killed his son. Being angry at the only parent that you have left is very psychologically distressing. It's much easier to be angry at the step-parent, which can create a much more tolerable stress and channel all of this into a much less painful place. Being estranged from a sibling or step-parent is much less psychologically trying, and reflecting back to see what actually happened is horribly difficult. You have to start with Karl being a master manipulator, likely a psychopath, and recognize that money is the root of all evil. My heart just goes out to everybody involved here. This is just awful. Well, Colette would say that Karl pleading guilty only solidified her belief that he had killed Christina. For decades, she had been trying to move her sister's case forward, reaching out to the Calaveras County DA. She told them of the barn fire, Karl's collecting insurance money, and she was told repeatedly, yeah, we'll look into it, with nothing happening. But with the guilty plea, Colette hoped that the Calaveras County DA would wake up. New York State's Jeff Arnold wrote a comprehensive 110-page report delving into the intricate connections between accidents, insurance, and lies concerning Karl. It dated back to Karl's days as a volunteer firefighter with the Varick Fire Department in Romulus in 1978. It mentioned the car fire from 1986, the state of Karl and Christina's marriage, the house fire, Christina's death, the barn fire, and more. Colette's statements that Karl was abusive to her sister were included, and that her sister was regularly calling her and talking about divorce. Colette's visit from December 22nd to the 24th in 1990 was significant. She swore that the bathroom window was working perfectly and was not boarded up with plywood, directly contradicting what Karl had told investigator Arnold. Arnold asked Karl, quote, "When did you board up that window? The day before the fire?" Karl insisted, no, it was months before, maybe a month and a half, end quote. Alex Carlson's statement, written when he was 16, was devastating. Quote, "I think my father Karl is capable of murder. I think he killed his first wife and my brother Levi. Dad and Levi didn't get along. They fought a lot. Dad told me that when he found Levi, Levi had a wrench in his hand. My dad also told me some things about the fire in California. He said the dog knocked over the kerosene heater. There's also a few times when he denied knowing how the fire started. Last Friday, my dad admitted to me that he spent over $1 million in this past year. My dad lies to me a lot," end quote. Wow. Calaveras County DA Barbara Yook looked all of this over, and it certainly appeared to be more than coincidence. On August 29, 2014, she filed murder charges against Karl Carlson in the death of his wife Christina more than 25 years earlier. Her accidental death was now ruled a homicide and turned over to District Attorney Jeff Stone. Stone and Calaveras DA investigator Mike Whitney flew to New York to interview Karl at the Clinton Correctional Facility, and a 6.5-hour videoed interview took place. Stone and Whitney pounced on Karl, deconstructing his lies, and this tape would be used very effectively at trial. Re-interviewing the vast number of witnesses would take time. 2 years later, after Karl was extradited from New York to California, Colette, Art, and Arlene began to think that maybe justice would come. September 2017 was a preliminary hearing with Scott Gross relentlessly representing Karl. He argued that there wasn't enough evidence to go to trial. All the records and physical evidence from the fire was long ago destroyed. Or so he thought. One of the original fire investigators, Carl Kent, do you remember him from the first episode? Carl Kent now said, quote, "I knew it was coming someday. I didn't know when," end quote. On retiring in 1997, Kent had taken the boxes of the Carlson fire evidence with him depositing them in his basement where they remained sealed. In the boxes were witness statements, tape recordings of interviews with Karlsson, and a videotape of the fire scene. Kent said, quote, "I figured the fire was very concerning to me, that there was a death, and we did not have the conclusion," end quote. Judge Thomas Smith ruled that the chain of custody was satisfactory and all the evidence would be entered into trial to be held on February 20th, 2018. 29 years after Christina Alexander Karlsson's death, his daughter, Erin DeRoche, testified for the prosecution about the lack of effort by the defendant, her father, to rescue her mother, and confirmed that Christina was a victim of domestic violence. Lynn Sanders testified. Her father, Victor Lyons, who is now deceased, had lived next door to the Karlssons in Murphy's. She said that Karl had been unusually interested in her dad's plans for that time and whether he was going to be at home. Well, Dad wasn't. He had gone to do a polar bear swim. So the nearest neighbor with a phone to call 911 was not going to be home the day of the fire. Dennis Hertz, the nephew of the owner of the Karlssons' renter house, said that Christina and Karl were preparing to move, and he'd stopped by the day before the fire, and the bathroom window was not boarded up. Mike Karlsson, Karl's brother, he produced a receipt from January 4th, 1991, showing that he bought the defendant and his children tickets to New York for the following day. This negated Karl's claim to the insurance company that he had spent thousands and thousands to transport everybody to New York. Art Alexander, Christina's father and Karl's employer at the time, produced canceled checks indicating that Karl had been paid in full that December, plus received an early Christmas bonus, with which Karl had purchased the life insurance on his daughter. Merle Lucan, the original State Farm insurance agent, had passed, but his 1991 statement was, quote, that he found it unusual for someone to walk into his office to inquire solely about life insurance. That had never happened before, not once in 40 years, end quote. And Karl was buying insurance for his wife, not himself. Mike Wynn, a volunteer firefighter who fought the blaze. 6 months after the fire, Karl showed up in Murphy's at Mike Wynn's ice cream shop, telling him the fire report needed to be settled or he couldn't get the insurance money. Karl told him he was concerned, quote, "They think I did it," end quote. Alan Teets, Christina's first husband, knew Karl from the Air Force in North Dakota, where temperatures could drop to negative 25 degrees. That's really cold. Yes. Christina was very familiar with kerosene, using it regularly for their heat, so she would never mistake a jug of kerosene for a barrel of water. Heather Gowan Smalls, the State Farm rep who interviewed Karl, testified that he had erupted, angrily claiming that, quote, "If I'd been in it for the money, why not the kids? I'd be a rich man. I'd have $500,000. But here I am stuck with these kids. It's a bitch," end quote. In 1991, she had recommended that Karlsson's claim be denied. Jan, Christina's first cousin, she authenticated the video of the burned-out house. Jurors saw a black soot-covered house, then the bathroom, then the medicine chest contents completely intact, and the plywood on the window, all unscathed. The rest of the bathroom was decimated. But there were some problems as well. Karl Kent had missed a third box of evidence. So this missing evidence included the 911 call, dispatch records, fire scene photos, items from the residence, the furnace, washer-dryer, water heater, electric heater, kerosene heater, swatch of carpet, the plywood from the window. All were lost. Defense attorney Scott Gross said this denied his client due process by law, as all the exculpatory evidence had been lost, and the defense could not conduct an independent investigation. For example, Karl claimed to have written Mike a check to cover for the cost of the airline tickets, and the bank records could no longer be retrieved, nor any medical records. Gross argued that Karl had been prescribed a large dose of Valium the day of the fire, and Karl had continued to use it in the days afterwards, which explained why Karl was, quote, acting strangely immediately after the fire, end quote. Defense witnesses were deceased. Jeanette Sprong was interviewed on January 24, 1991, saying that she had been on the phone with Chris, who told her that the dog and cat had just knocked over the kerosene. Christina had called Jeanette asking how to absorb the spill. So Scott Gross asked for a dismissal, which was denied. Some defense witnesses were Florence Kahn, who entertained the Carlsons over New Year's Eve. She never witnessed any acrimony between the couple. Neighbors Lily Spiva and Joyce Ingram were the ones Karl had run to for help, Joyce Ingram making the 911 call, and Mrs. Spiva witnessed Karl directing firefighters to the burning house. They both saw Karl crying uncontrollably that day. Karl wanted a speedy trial, conflicting with Scott Gross, who kept delaying. His change of venue request was denied, and then Gross wanted an expert to conduct a mental evaluation of Karl, who Gross claimed was unable to stand trial. Well, nonsense. Karl said he wasn't insane, and he passed the mental evaluation easily. A new trial date was set for October 3, 2018. And the night prior, Gross asked for a conference with the judge, District Attorney Barbara Yoke, and New York's Deputy District Attorney Jeff Arnold. Scott Gross then recused himself due to a conflict of interest, sending out shockwaves. The whole trial was postponed until 2019 so a new public defender could get up to speed. This stunned family and friends who now thought the trial was never going to happen. But it did happen. The trial finally began January 2020, almost 3 decades after Christina Alexander Carlson had died. Now 60 years old, with his salt and pepper hair looking distinguished, Karl relished the media attention. He saw all of this as a game and one he would win, flashing a sly grin. He viewed the jurors, quote, as a bunch of stupid hicks, end quote. Erin, now 36, testified that she heard her mother screaming, with her father moving very slowly. After they'd moved to New York, she saw innumerable events of violence against her and her siblings. Levi had taken the brunt of their dad's anger, with him hit with pipes, shovels, electric cattle prods. She never told because he threatened to kill her if she did. New defense attorney Richard Esquivel claimed Erin had a distorted memory of the fire because she recalled differently than she had at the time. Erin stated she hadn't told anyone her dad had moved slowly at the time because, as a 6-year-old, she hadn't realized the significance. And Karl thought the jury would see right through Erin. As fire officials testified, Karl shook his head, trying to convey that these were old retired men relying on faulty memories with no physical evidence to back them up. He became a little nervous when Ken Buskey, the forensic electrical engineer, took the stand, learning Buskey kept a copy of his report from March 1991, plus his contemporaneous notes he'd written at the fire scene. His diagram of the plywood over the windows showed exactly where 17 nails were placed. Buskey said he looked for fire witness marks on wall outlets. Finding none, this was not the cause of the fire, nor were the appliances. He found no exposed wires in the attic. Karl hinted that the space heater in the bathroom might have been the cause, but Ken showed it was not plugged in at the time. As for the trouble light, it had been plugged in, but Buskey experimented. Lying on a piece of similar carpet for 70 minutes, it did not ignite. The prosecutor projected a copy of a napkin with the sketch that Buskey had drawn for Heather Gower Small 30 years before, examining the wicking patterns in the carpet caused by the saturation of kerosene in the burning. Buskey had determined that there were two separate applications of kerosene. Quote, there had been a story that kerosene had been spilled in this hallway previously, and it looked like, yes, there had been a kerosene pour days prior, because it totally diffused itself through the carpet, end quote. On further examination of this carpet, quote, a second application of kerosene occurred just minutes ahead of the fire. You can see the difference in the wicking of these patterns on the napkin diagram here, end quote. As Buskey highlighted a U-shaped pattern with, quote, well-defined edges, which meant very little wicking occurred, and for very little wicking to occur, the time frame has to be short, end quote. The cause of this fire? A human hand. The ignition source? A match or cigarette lighter. And there is the case, motor bookies. Feeling sick to her stomach on January 24th, 2020, Colette took the stand, refusing to look at Karl. The district attorney established that she was Christina's sister, and she had last seen her sister on Christmas Eve morning, and there were no broken windows in her home. She herself had taken a shower and given both of her kids baths, and the water ran just fine. There was no need to bring in jugs of water from outside. Learning of her sister's death, she told Karl that she wanted to see her, and Karl replied that she couldn't because her sister was a, quote, crispy critter, end quote. This left me speechless, utterly, utterly speechless. How do you say that about your dead wife? I can't even. Prior bad acts. All right, this is always a tad confusing to us lay people, but the general rule is this. Prior bad acts of a defendant are not allowed at trial because these would unfairly prejudice a jury. But there are exceptions, and an important one is when building a pattern case that links the defendant's modus operandi. Because Karl had used the same MO in the death of Levi, the California jury could hear about this murder and Karl's guilty plea. So you're probably saying, well, wait, one died in an alleged arson fire and the other had a truck pushed on top of him. All right, so I'll explain. Lieutenant John Clear flew in from New York to testify, saying that Karl admitted to knowing Levi was alive after the truck fell and did nothing to save him, choosing to collect Levi's $700,000 in insurance money purchased just weeks earlier. Then the jury learned about the mysterious barn fire. William Ostrander, the insurance investigator, testified that Karl had purchased additional insurance on his horses just weeks before the fire, receiving $70,000. Prior to Christina's death, Karl had taken out a $200,000 insurance policy, and then the house fire. The prosecution felt that his MO was well established. Now, the defense didn't have a whole lot to present beyond, where's the evidence? Two witnesses took the stand. One was John Miller, a fire expert who testified that Carlson's story about the fire and what happened on January 1st, 1991 were accurate and could be scientifically corroborated. Defense attorney Esquivel recalled Ken Buskey, reminding the jury that he had gone to the fire scene on February 7th, 1991, 5 weeks after the event. And in his closing, Esquivel stressed that in 1991, they had all the evidence and Buskey's report, and Karl had not been arrested, and the insurance was paid out. Now, unable to verify Buskey's report, with evidence missing, they decided to charge Karl. It made no sense. Esquivel said, if the evidence wasn't good enough in 1991, quote, it's not nearly good enough now, end quote. In Barbara Yook's closing, she described Christina Carlson's last horrific moments. She summarized every minute piece of evidence, highlighting the key points from each defense witness. Just over 2 hours later, she concluded, quote, when you kill somebody for money, it's murder. It's time to tell the defendant that he will not get away with Christina's death any longer, end quote. Judge Smith then read the jury instructions, and the 7 women and 5 men went to deliberate. After 7 hours deliberating on February 3rd, 2020, which happened to be Levi's birthday, the jury returned a verdict. Karl Holger Karlsson was guilty of murder in the first. Christina Alexander Karlsson was killed by an act of arson. There was gasping, tears, and hugs while Karl was coldly silent. March 17, 2020, Karl was sentenced right as COVID began its deadly path around the world. The lockdown had not begun yet, but travel was becoming dangerous. So Erin did not fly back to see her father sentenced, with Katie opting to remain home as well, her opinion about her father shifting 180 degrees. Karl, not knowing that they weren't coming, knew their victim impact statements would be very difficult to hear. And lo and behold, he was able to duck out of court claiming he had a low-grade fever. What a coward. Colette spoke passionately about the heartache of losing her best friend and sister, as well as her nephew Levi. Karl was a person, quote, whose love of money far exceeds the respect for human life. Karl likes to kill, and I truly believe if Karl Karlsson gets out of prison, he will kill again, end quote. Arlene spoke about her daughter Christina, saying, quote, you, Karl, you walked away and left her to die. You need to be locked up for the rest of your life, end quote. Katie's videotaped statement was played. Her father had driven her to suicidal thoughts and expensive counseling sessions, and she blamed him and her stepmother as well, that she had suffered from an abusive childhood, which simply devastated Cindy because that wasn't true. Katie said that learning her father collected nearly $1 million in blood money shook her. Quote, I ask that you give me the comfort of knowing that my father will never be released from prison, end quote. Colette read Erin's impact statement, a damning diatribe, blaming Karl for, quote, physically, mentally, emotionally abusing her and her siblings, which will haunt her for the rest of her life, end quote. Her mother had not died quickly, quote, that she had time to think, that she would never see her babies again, that Erin never got a chance to know her mother, and growing up without the genuine, authentic love of a parent, end quote. Erin hated Cindy as well, and she and Karl had spent recklessly after Levi's death, quote, taking away everything Levi's life insurance could have provided for his daughters, end quote. Erin would have peace knowing that her father could never hurt anyone again. And my heart breaks for all of these people so terribly impacted by Karl Karlsson. Judge Smith sentenced Karl Karlsson to life without parole to be served after he finished the remainder of his New York prison sentence. He called Karlsson a coward and wished the law permitted him to render a harsher sentence. Karl Karlsson will serve the duration of his sentence in New York before being transferred to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to start serving out his new sentence for Christina's murder. In an interview with CBS News, Christina's father, Art Alexander, said of Christina's death, quote, he boarded it up so he knew she couldn't get out. I went back the next day to get my truck, and there was a pick sitting right there next to the tree. He could have grabbed that pick and pulled it off, but he didn't. I thought he got away with murder, but it finally caught up with him, end quote. He added that if investigators had done their jobs back in 1991, Levi would still be alive. It's a tough thing to reconcile in your heart. Erin DeRoche and Katie Reynolds have given a number of interviews describing Karl as abusive. In addition to beating Levi, Erin was given tasks such as carrying buckets of water, which he made her do until her small child-sized body gave out. He belittled her, telling her her mother would be ashamed of her and that she had a big butt, ruining her self-confidence. Katie Reynolds confirms that while she wasn't beaten, he would drive her into a corner and loom threateningly over her. Now, Cindy addressed the allegations made against her on sentencing day. She says she met Karl, a widower struggling to raise 3 traumatized kids, and she married him because she loved him and the kids needed her. Being a stepmother is never easy, but the kids grew up with a swimming pool, bikes, toys, sleds, hay rides, and birthday parties, attended summer camps, participated in sports and activities. She certainly had made mistakes, but she loved them the best she could. Before leaving for the Air Force, Erin wrote Cindy a cherished letter, quote, "If my mother had had to handpick someone, it would have been you," end quote. That letter is the truth. Cindy had been a pawn, not only of Karl's, but also of Tony Chrissy's. Cindy wrote to New York Life, encouraging them to investigate him, with them concluding Chrissy's actions were unethical, but not illegal. Cindy insists she never used Levi's money for her own personal gain, save for that damned facelift. She realized Karl was burning through the money, and he never intended it for Elettra or Ivy. When Elettra turned 18, Cindy sent her a substantial check. Ivy will also receive a check at age 18 because that is what Levi would have wanted. Cindy is responsible for Karl's arrest and justice for Levi and Christina. Many family members suspected Karl, but did nothing. And Cindy believes they all have Levi's blood on their hands, putting family reputation first and foremost. After quite a power struggle over the farm, pitting relative against relative, Cindy was able to sell the farm to a Mennonite family for $200,000. Much of that went to liens against the estate and paid for Karl's attorneys. She regrets drowning her sorrows in booze, and with sobriety comes clarity, and she is now at peace knowing she helped put Karl behind bars. She believes that Elettra and Ivy were next on Karl's hit list. She loves her granddaughters and today wishes only the best for her stepdaughters, who she still loves. She is grateful to have Dave in her life and for Aphrodite Jones for telling this story. She's proud of the young man Alex has become, himself married, and she is a grandma again. And she sends a special message to Christina and Levi. And for that, you really need to read the book. This story just blew me away. I really had no idea. And my analysis. First, if you put clothing with kerosene on them in a dryer, the vapors will ignite. It does not blow white smoke, as Karl claimed. My source is my firefighter brother, who retired after 29 years of service. Second, Karl Carlson is a highly unique serial killer. He fits the FBI Behavioral Analysis 2023 definition of serial killer, which is a series of 2 or more killings with common characteristics as to suggest the reasonable possibility that these crimes were committed by the same actor or actors. Karl Carlson is a profit killer, looking to murder the people closest to him to gain insurance money. He then thrives on the attention and the sympathy that comes after a death, playing the grieving husband or father to the hilt. It remains all about him. When people move on and he wasn't the center of attention anymore, he got angry. Research shows us that male profit serial killers represent about 28% of male serial killing. You may have heard of Dr. H.H. Holmes, the late 19th century charming, ruthless profit killer from Chicago. Holmes murdered his victims for inheritance and life insurance policy payouts, where Holmes was the sole beneficiary. Sound familiar? Holmes had constructed a large hotel, office, shops, and a maze of deadly rooms from where few returned, which is referred to as his murder castle. Luring his victims into asphyxia chambers, he would watch their slow suffocation, their fear, and panic, or perhaps lull them into worse rooms of death. Holmes trapped, tortured, and killed, and often sold their skeletons to medical schools. Fraudulent insurance schemes were his downfall, and I do see characteristics that overlap between Holmes and Karl Carlson. But Carlson is unusual, and he more closely aligns with the female hedonist game killer from the Kelleher topography. Yes, he's a girly serial killer. I hope he hears about that. First, about 11% of serial killers are female. And of these, approximately 69% of female serial killers kill for profit. Females are more likely to kill infants and children than their male counterparts. And the vast majority of female serial killers' victims are family members. All right, this is Karl Carlson, right? Further, female prophet killers operate at home, where they will find their victims among the family, and they kill to improve or maintain their lifestyle. This is Karl. Unlike Karl, 70% of male serial killers kill strangers. Now, the method females choose are usually more covert than other serial murderers. Here we see Karl setting a death trap and exiting the scene, murdering in absentia. He sets a fire, he walks away. As he confessed, the opportunity presented itself, and he knocked the truck off the jack onto Levi and walks away. To him, his hands are clean, rationalization kicking in. He sets a trap and extracts himself from the scene, letting death happen away from him. Female serial killers kill like this. After the murder of a relative, the prophet killer will usually wait for a period of time before striking again, in this case 17 years, to allow any suspicions by those in close proximity to subside. Or maybe you just quickly move across the country, out of sight, out of mind, right? Based on the Radford University Serial Killer Database for 2023, female serial killers are more likely to have both male and female victims, spot on Karl, contrasting with males who are more likely to kill female strangers. How many serial killers kill with fire? 0.08%. Staging accidents isn't even on the list of serial killer methodology. So Karl is a rare one. Should I even get into his daddy issues, seeking his father's approval with Junior Carlson failing to give it repeatedly? And profit? Well, Karl collected a great sum of insurance money, well over $1 million. And this all comes to light during the trial for Christina's murder, when those prior bad acts are presented and come in. His MO, buying insurance, and then on average, 18 days later, a death trap is sprung, Karl exits, someone is murdered. He collects the newly acquired insurance, his motive profit. Karl's brother Mike, ex-wife Cindy, her sister Bev, and I suspect most of Christina's family, Art, Arlene, and Colette, would all agree that Karl is a psychopath. Charming, glib, manipulating, cunning, lacking empathy entirely. They certainly know Karl better than we do, so I will take their word for it. I think we can all feel somewhat safer knowing that he will never again be free, and that there has been some justice for Christina and Levi. I've said I thought I knew this story. I'd watched the documentaries, I'd watched Dateline, but after reading Levi's Eyes, I see I really did not. And I really do recommend this book. And truthfully, I have just scratched the surface here. In 2 weeks, in episode 90, Aphrodite and Romulus, I speak with Aphrodite Jones, with her sharing more of her insights into Karl, who she had access to for over 2 years. She also interviewed Cindy repeatedly, and we discuss a lot of things that are not in the book. So please join me in 2 weeks, episode 90, part 4 of my series on Levi's Eyes. Now, who doesn't love horses? I'm thinking of a certain Patreon murder bookie, Rebecca, right now. My next book, just in time for the Triple Crown thoroughbred races, is Broken, The Suspicious Death of Aladar and the End of Horse Racing's Golden Age, by animal law attorney Fred Cray. I met Fred at Crimecon in 2023, and the story he told me, his knowledge so detailed, he impressed me, and my Patreon murder bookies concurred. It was a cool, quiet evening at Calumet Farms, home to many valuable racehorses, including the powerhouse stallion Aladar, and they'd settled into their stalls for the evening. While nothing seemed out of the ordinary, something was terribly amiss. A grievously injured horse was discovered, cause unknown, and this jump-started one of the biggest mysteries to ever hit horse racing. Author Fred Cray peels back the onion layers, revealing the shocking testimony and key evidence that leads to the truth about the death of the magnificent racehorse, Aladar. Thank you for listening, Murder Bookies. I see you as you hear me. Please take a few minutes to leave an awesome review that will help me make new Murder Bookies. Share your thoughts with me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com, on Twitter or on Facebook, Instagram. New spring designs are out on Spreadshop, so get your merch. The links are on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com with sources, photographs, diagrams, show notes, our snack recipe, and wine pairing too. Always trust your gut and lock your windows and doors. See you next week at Crimecon. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music by Carl Hosanna and lyrics by Otto Harbach.